Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today on the importance of community inclusion, which is the fourth and final session of the Principles and Practices of Recovery-Oriented Care series. Larry will again be leading this webinar. Larry Davidson is a professor of psychiatry at Yale Medical School, where he directs the program for recovery and community health. He is also the editor of the American Journal of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and director of the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. I'll be turning things over to him shortly, but first I'd like to review a few items with you all. Please mute computer speakers if you're calling through the phone to avoid echo. During the presentation, thank you. During the presentation, if you have any technical difficulties or questions about the topic, you can use the chat and questions box down on the bottom left. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing tomorrow on our website, along with the PowerPoint slides and any additional resources discussed today. Information about CUs and certificates will be sent in a post-webinar email. At the end of the webinar, an evaluation will pop up on your screen regarding this webinar. Please take a moment to fill it out if you can, so we can continue to improve our trainings. And you can always email us if you have any questions. And with that, I will hand it off to Larry. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Vanessa. Good afternoon or good morning to you, depending on where you are in the country. And thank you for taking the time to share with us for about an hour today to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart and hopefully at least distracts you from the coronavirus for about an hour. But that topic is community inclusion. And the main lesson of today's discussion is going to be the argument that community inclusion provides a foundation for recovery rather than being reserved as its reward, meaning that people should not have to get better when having a mental illness in order to enjoy the riches, the resources, the people in their community, but in being able to be a part of the community provides a foundation for the hard work of recovery. And that's a shift in thinking from an older model to a newer model, and I'll be trying to capture the essence of that in the next 45 minutes or so. In order to do that, I'm going to need to distinguish clinical recovery from personal recovery because I think there continues to be some confusion about that, and it's an important distinction for the purposes of the rest of today's discussion. I will then shift to talking about, for the remainder of the time, personal recovery, which will be the focus, and personal recovery in particular from a social justice disability rights perspective. And you'll see how the argument for community inclusion needs to be grounded in a disability rights perspective. We'll then talk about how to put that perspective into action. We'll include mentioning of individual placement and support approaches, which are very important inroads to recovery, to community life, but then also talk about the need for community interventions, community partnerships, community collaboratives, or social cooperatives as an addition to the array of interventions that we have available. So that's what I hope to cover. I want to start with a story. Don't bother reading the slide. I just want to tell you a brief story about Tom Kirk, who is the dapper gentleman in the upper right corner of this slide. Tom was commissioner for the mental health department in Connecticut from 1999 to 2009, or yes, 2009, and did a lot of work during those 10 years to try to transform the state to a recovery orientation. One of the things Tom did was go around visiting programs. He liked to talk to people. He's a people person. And in one particular case, he was at a group home for people who had come out of a state hospital. We no longer have state hospitals in Connecticut with the exception of one general psychiatry program. But those days we were still doing deinstitutionalization. And Tom went to a group home and met with the staff, and as he liked to do, talk with some of the residents. And when the day was over, he met with the staff for debriefing and talked a bit about his impressions of the program, and then said, tell me about Steve. I'd like to know about Steve. I had coffee with Steve earlier today. I'd like to hear your perspective on Steve. So staff said, oh, Steve, he's terrific. He's been with us about 9 months. He settled in relatively quickly. He takes his medications on time without any fuss. He goes to all his groups. He's been really a model resident for this program. We think he's doing great. And Tom said, well, I'm very happy to hear that. That's consistent with what I experienced with Steve as well. So tell me what's next. And the staff looked at him puzzled and said, well, he's taking his medication. He's going to his groups. He's settled in nicely, follows the rules. He's like a model resident. He's doing really well. And Tom said, well, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that. But what's next for Steve? Because he's 27 and he's got a long life ahead of him. And what's he going to do with that? What are his hopes and dreams? What are his aspirations? What would he like to do with his time? And it turned out that the staff, despite knowing Steve for about 9 months, really had no idea what Steve's interests beyond treatment and rehabilitation were. And in the short time that Tom had coffee with Steve, he learned that Steve had been an aspiring auto mechanic before he developed mental illness, that he was interested in cars, that he loved to watch NASCAR races on TV, and that his hobby, basically, if he had one, was cars. So Tom brought that information back to the staff and asked them what they thought they could do with that information. And they were saying, well, Steve's not ready to work yet. He can't go to school to become an auto mechanic. We're not sure that really has much relevance to the work we do here. And Tom said, oh, no. You could start by seeing that he has a subscription to an auto magazine, or that he has people to watch NASCAR races with him, or that he has people interested in the fact that he's interested in cars. And I saw a car service center about a half a block down the road on my way to this program. I wonder if he could hang out there or maybe do some volunteer work there. There's lots of things Steve could do. So that's basically the premise of today's presentation. And I try to capture it in this slide given to me by Janis Condor, who's a good friend and colleague who does a lot of work around community inclusion. It says, well, this is a very impressive resume, young man. I think you're going to make a fine patient. Steve wanted to be more than a resident of a group home, and all of the people we work with want to be more than clients of the mental health system. They have aspirations, they have dreams, they have ideas about how they'd like to spend their time other than in programs. And that's an important source of information for us because that's an important focus of our efforts. I learned this over the course of my career mostly through people with mental health conditions who conveyed to me how they want the same things out of life as other people do. They've taught me that they're not their diagnoses, they're not subsumed entirely by the illness itself, and they continue to exist alongside of that illness. We spent some time, I think, in our last webinar talking about how to separate the person from the illness and see the person in his or her own right. But unfortunately, mental health care has traditionally addressed the illness and the symptoms much more so than the person in his or her everyday life. Now, Tom had visited that group home, like I said, somewhere in the early 2000s. So we've maybe come a ways since then, and maybe people are asking Steve about his interests now in ways they didn't 20 years ago. Hopefully that's the case. But I think there's still a lot more work to be done in helping people with their everyday lives in and above their illness. Mentioned that I learned this from the people I worked with. I remember one woman in particular was a 45-year-old woman who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia for many years, had been in and out of hospitals, but was doing relatively well in the community, and I was her clinician, and she had a job coach because she wanted to work, and she was very unhappy with her job coach. So we had a meeting, the three of us had a meeting to discuss what was going on and how it could be improved, and the job coach was basically saying, I can't do anything with you because you won't ever put on clean clothes and wash your hair and make it look nice. And she said basically, you always want me to get all dressed up, but you're never willing to take me any place. So they had come to a standoff where the job coach insisted that the woman clean up her act, and the woman insisted that she have an appointment to go to clean her act up for, or else there was no point in putting on clean clothes or washing her hair. We should avoid those kind of stalemates if possible, and we should consider that if people have nowhere to go and nothing to do, they're unlikely to demonstrate good ADLs. Think about it, if every morning were a Saturday morning assuming you work Monday through Friday. And every morning or a Saturday morning where you had nowhere to go and nothing necessarily to do, wouldn't you hang out in your pajamas or your sweatpants and your baseball caps? Certainly that's what I used to do on Saturday mornings before I had children to get me busy. So to understand this better, we need to distinguish. Mike Slade has made a useful distinction between clinical recovery and personal recovery. And I bring this up because I think this confusion persists in the field still to this day. Clinical recovery refers to an outcome. It refers to the absence of the signs, symptoms, and impairments associated with a mental illness. And while it may manifest in about 68% of persons diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, and I'll say that again, about 68% of persons diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, meaning schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression with psychotic features, about 68% of them will reach a clinical recovery outcome, but it can take decades to achieve. The longitudinal studies that we have shown that over time, somewhere between 32 and 35 years it may take for some people to recover. But clinical recovery is still possible. It just takes time for a lot of people. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people. Personal recovery, on the other hand, which is a newer concept that has come about through the consumer survivor movement going back to the 1970s, refers to a process involving the reclaiming or recovering of self-directed and meaningful life, despite and in the face of an enduring serious mental illness which may or may not eventually result in clinical recovery. One point of personal recovery, it's a very rich concept, but one point of personal recovery is that it may take your schizophrenia 32 years to go away, but that doesn't mean you have to spend the next 32 years sitting in your apartment being alone with nothing to do. That even while you may have a serious mental illness, you can still reclaim a self-directed and meaningful life, and you can still do things and have a life even while you're continuing to experience aspects of a mental illness. This was defined initially by Patricia Deegan in 1988. This is the earliest reference I can find to this sense of recovery. And she defined it as the lived or real-life experience of people as they accept and overcome the challenge of the disability. They experience themselves as recovering a new sense of self and of purpose within and beyond the limits of the disability. And I underline disability because that's an important concept for the rest of this webinar. I know it's a contentious term in the mental health community. Some people find it very useful for the reasons I'm going to describe. Other people find it offensive, or other people find it unnecessarily pessimistic, or other people don't think it fits because they don't see themselves as disabled. And that's fine. It's not for me or anybody else to tell people how to view their lives and themselves. But the point of Pat's raising this as a disability is an important political point. And I'm going to insist on using it for that purpose. She was writing this at the time that there was a tremendous amount of advocacy and activism around the Americans with Disabilities Act and the need to include people with behavioral health conditions, serious mental illnesses, and substance use disorders as having a disability if they were going to be entitled to the same rights to community inclusion as people with other disabilities. And if you're not familiar with this history or would like to learn a bit more about it, these two papers referenced at the bottom are very helpful. The first one is the one in which Pat first defines this sense of what we now call personal recovery. The second one is where she talks about the links between the mental health consumer survivor movement and the independent living movement and how we need to learn from our physically disabled peers to be better able to claim our rights to community inclusion. And she talks about that as taking back control over our own lives. So disability is meant primarily in a legal, legislative, policy sense, because persons with disabilities are entitled under American law, federal law, to reasonable accommodations to enable them to participate fully in community life. So if someone has a prolonged mental illness that is impairing their functioning in certain ways for which they need help, it's useful to label that as a disability. Clinical recovery is more a matter of active treatment or rehabilitation. It's a clinical concept, and it's largely a clinical process. Although discrimination and other social factors may impede the availability, access, and effectiveness of care, it's primarily a clinical concept. Personal recovery is more a matter of being activated for and engaging in self-management. Personal recovery is what I do with my life and with my health conditions. It's also influenced by an array of social determinants of health beyond access to care, including stigma and discrimination, unsafe or unstable housing, limited access to education, prolonged unemployment, loss of parenting rights, and lack of inclusion in valued social roles and communities of one's peers, such as faith communities or civic communities, Rotary clubs, Elks clubs, Boy Scouts, leaders, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that if we're talking about things like accessing education, accessing employment, being able to preserve your rights as a parent, being able to access housing, in all of these ways, it's important that personal recovery be associated with a disability perspective so that we can ensure that people have rights to these things to which other people have rights as well. The general public has rights as well. The other point of this disability concept is that it's defined as the result of a person-environment interaction. You're not disabled in a vacuum, but you're disabled in the context of a lack of community supports. So it, by definition, acknowledges the role of social, cultural, and political determinants of mental health and lays the foundations for the use of environmental modifications, or what we're going to call community supports. It's also very important these days in particular because it establishes a justification for the funding of long-term supports, thus avoiding the critique of society not having a responsibility for funding what has come to be described as an individual's responsibility for their personal journey. Bill Anthony, a towering figure in the recovery movement and a wonderful person, was the first to define what we're now calling personal recovery as a personal journey. And that's had a lot of unfortunate repercussions because now systems around the country and in England and in Australia are starting to say that they don't have responsibility for providing funding for people who are on a personal journey. If everybody's in recovery, then everybody would qualify for services, so people with more disabling conditions shouldn't get preference over anybody else. I find this very concerning, and I'm trying to advocate otherwise. And one example I use is eyeglasses. You can't see me, although you saw my picture a few minutes ago, but I wear eyeglasses, and I've worn eyeglasses since I was in the 7th grade, so since I was about 13 years old. Never once in the 47 years I've worn eyeglasses has anyone ever said, you need to give your glasses back, your time is up. If your eyes aren't better by now, they're never going to be. We would never tell someone who uses a wheelchair that their turn with the wheelchair is up because someone else needs the wheelchair. The notion of community supports is that they are time unlimited because they help people to compensate for an impairment that is not their responsibility or their fault. But we in mental health have a long history of doing just the opposite. We routinely say people have had enough of X, they've recovered enough from Y, they need to do this on their own now. And that runs counter to the disability rights, independent living movement perspective, which I'm trying to advocate for here. It's more consistent with the fact that I still have eyeglasses. So what have we done? What have we done to enable people with psychiatric disabilities, which is what we're going to call it for today's conversation? What have we done to enable people with psychiatric disabilities to have lives in their communities? First program of which I'm aware was Fountain House, which was founded in New York City in 1948 and is still operating in Midtown Manhattan on very precious real estate, and it's a wonderful place if you've never been there. Members come there for all kinds of events and activities, including vocational rehabilitation and job supports and employment, education supports and social supports and all kinds of things. It's like an enclave community where you come and you're a member and you can be a member for life. And that was an early effort. Later in the deinstitutionalization era, we started to experiment with residential alternatives like halfway houses, quarter-way houses, group homes, etc., and eventually developed some approaches to vocational rehabilitation. But by the 1970s, the institutionalization was already being considered a failed policy for two main reasons which are relevant to this topic. One is that funding had never been provided to create the community-based supports people needed to live in the community. They were offered Thorazine and psychotherapy, but not any other kind of community supports. And the interventions that had been developed, primarily in the vocational and the residential arenas, were not affording people lives beyond the mental health system. One meta-analysis that Gary Bond did many years ago suggested that it took people an average of 43 years to get a job through a vocational rehabilitation program. This, before anybody gets upset, who is a supported employment advocate, this was before that we had supported employment. This was when all we had was vocational rehabilitation, and it didn't work very well. Neither did trying to go through from a halfway house to a quarter-way house to a shared apartment to these kinds of continuums of care did not result in people living the kind of lives in the community that they had hoped in the community rather than in the mental health system. It took until the 1970s and 80s for us to start learning some lessons that enabled us to develop the individualized supports we now have. We learned by then that many people still needed support. They needed more than treatment. They needed ongoing support. We learned that skills did not generalize from hospitals or classrooms to everyday life. Erving Goffman, the famous sociologist who wrote about asylums and stigma back in the 60s and 70s, talked about hospitalizing someone for a serious mental illness and discharging them back to the community was like taking a drowning person out of a lake, teaching them to ride a bicycle, and putting them back in a lake. That very little that was going to be done during the hospital stay would generalize back to what they needed to be able to do in the community. And this is when we learned learning requires modeling. Marianne Test, who is a good friend, was one of the developers of assertive community treatment in Madison in the 60s. And she talked about the social psychology experiments that informed their work, that if you had a car on the side of the road that had a flat tire, then you set it up this way as an experiment. And you waited to see how many people would stop to help the person change their tire. Very few people did. But if you had a car with a flat tire and you had a person, a co-conspirator, so to speak, who would stop their car for the first car and was out helping them change their tire, and then you put another car further down the road that did not have a helper but it was just a person waiting with a car with a flat tire, many more people would stop. Having seen the first person do it, many more people would stop further down the road for the second car. This is a basic premise of social psychology, that modeling is how learning takes place. And with modeling and support, we learned through assertive community treatment that people could become involved in meaningful activities of their choice. What are community supports? Community supports are derived from the independent living movement in persons with physical disabilities. I'll give examples in a minute. They help people compensate for challenges posed by the nature of their disability, and there's a wide range of supports for a wide range of activities. So some examples are seeing eye dogs or white canes for people who've lost use of their eyes. They can use the dogs or the canes to get around the community and participate in activities of their choice. For people who have lost mobility, we have wheelchairs, as I mentioned before. And nobody's going to take someone's wheelchair away just because they've had it for 6 months or 6 years, because they continue to need it. For people with hearing impairments, there are visual aids to let them know when someone's at the door or when someone's on the phone or when things like that. We also have International American Sign Language for people who cannot hear as a support, a way to be able to communicate with others. So the question in recovery-oriented care becomes, what kind of community supports have people with psychiatric disabilities found similarly useful in increasing their access to and participation in the naturally occurring community activities of their choice. What have we found that people need and benefit from? First and foremost, support, in the sense of other people. Having other people believe in and support me, not having to do things by myself, not having to be the only one who thinks I can do something, but having other people believe in my capacities and in my abilities to pursue my interests, and having them accompany me along the way if needed. Hope, tangible and living proof of the possibility of recovery. This is in part because of the nature of the disability, but it's in large part also due to the stigma and discrimination that have been associated with serious mental illnesses for the last 200 years. People need to see role models, need to see that it's possible to have a mental illness and have a job, or have a mental illness and go to school, or have a mental illness and live independently in their own apartment, or have a mental illness and go to church or synagogue or the mosque. Hope is a support. Opportunities. Bill Clinton once defined care as bringing people to opportunities. People need to be brought to opportunities. They need other people encouraging them to try new things. And when doing that, they need clear directions, instructions, and expectations that need to be broken down into smaller steps, manageable steps, and they need to know that they have the permission and the encouragement to ask questions about things they don't know. I was surprised to learn from a vocational rehabilitation practitioner that one of the most common questions, one of the most common concerns people have on the first day of a new job is not so much will they be able to do the job or will people like me, but how will I know where the bathroom is and what I'll need to do when I need to use the bathroom. These can be very seemingly small, seemingly trivial things, but if people haven't worked for a long time, if people haven't been in school settings for a long time, they forget those small things, and they need to be able to ask questions, and they need for people to be patient in guiding them through the tasks involved in taking advantage of the opportunities that are made available to them. And lastly, some people could use memory aids or other devices to assist them in structuring their time. We can't assume that people either have or will think of these kind of simple tools. So when you're working with a person who's about to start a new job, do they have an alarm clock? Do they have something that's going to get them up in time so that they make it to work on time? They may not have an alarm clock because they may not have needed one for years. They were never expected to be anywhere. So if they're going to do something like that, do they have the tools they need? So an alarm clock can be useful in many ways. Having a pad of paper and a pencil to write things down can be useful. People may not know that that's an okay thing to do. There are more and more tools now in apps that people can use to help do memory guides or memory aids or remind people of things ahead of time so that they don't miss important meetings or miss important appointments. So those are some of the community supports. But the most important support is the first one, is the other people. And those can be in the form of family, in the form of friends, in the form of providers of psychiatric rehabilitation or community supports. They need to be other people who can show me the way and make sure that I have somebody I can ask questions of when I'm unsure about things or when I don't know what to do. But now, what do people use supports for? I'm sorry if that seems like a silly question, but I think it's useful to stop and pause for a minute and say, what do people use supports for? What kind of things do people want to do? If we go back to the story of Steve that we started with, Steve wouldn't need supports if all he was going to do was sit at the coffee table at the group home, take his medication on time, and go to his groups. He didn't need support for that. So people need supports if they're going to step out of their comfort zone and try new things. And many people, I would dare to say most people, want to be able to do that. S.O. Leek, who was an early leader of the mental health consumer movement, put it best, I think, when she said, what makes life valuable for those of us with mental illnesses? You could also say, what makes life interesting? What makes life worth living? Exactly what is necessary for other people. We need to feel wanted, accepted, and loved. We need support from friends and family. We need to feel a part of the human race, to have friends. We need to give and receive love. People want the same things that everybody else wants. They want to spend their time in worthwhile, meaningful ways that make their lives and other people's lives better, and they want to love and be loved. I've been surprised by how often what people want to do is help other people, especially people who've been recipients of care, recipients of help offered to them that have been very meaningful and enabling. They want to be able to turn around and do the same for others. I could choose to be a nobody, a nothing, and just say, the hell with it, the hell with everything. I'm not going to deal with anything. And there are times when I feel like that, and yet I'm part of the world. I'm a human being. And human beings usually kind of do things together to help each other out. And I want to be part of that. If you're not part of the world, it's pretty miserable, pretty lonely. So I think degree of involvement is important. Involvement in some kind of activity, hopefully an activity which benefits somebody. That gives me the sense that I have something to offer. That's all I'm talking about. And I would reinforce the part that that's all I'm talking about today as well. People want valued social roles. They want to be able to do things that help themselves and other people. It made me feel like I was being helpful, and in situations like that, I don't think so much about my illness. It kind of goes on the back burner, because sometimes I just think about my illness, and it seems like when I'm helping somebody, or somebody says something nice to me, as soon as people say, oh, you look good, things like that, it makes me feel better about myself. And another person said, by helping others, you're not totally worthless. Like it's a natural human characteristic. That if you're able to help others, then you're worth something. It's essential to life for people to feel necessary. Giving something to someone else makes you feel worth something yourself. And it's important for us to keep in mind that these can need to be in incremental steps. These kinds of activities may require considerable effort over a considerable amount of time for people who are very disabled, but that doesn't mean they're not worth pursuing. This person was a Fountain House member who said, I didn't believe in me because when you get mental illness, all your self-respect disappears. Your self-esteem goes away. And today I see that I've been in the kitchen making food for 60 people. It came by like baby steps, you know. Very slowly, very gradually, you start to notice these positive things about yourself. You start to think in a positive way. I'm able to do this. Now maybe I can do that. There was a movie, I don't know, 20-some years ago with Bill Murray called What About Bob? It was all about baby steps. Richard Dreyfuss was a psychotherapist who published a book on the importance of baby steps. I don't like to call them baby steps because that sounds demeaning, but gradual steps, incremental steps toward a longer-term goal. And in welcoming environments. People need, again, this is talking about support. People need to be environments in which they feel welcome, where they feel like they belong, in order to take the risks of trying new things. I guess I'm sort of like feeling like I matter in a group or have a part. I'm not so invisible. Like when I'm there and if I'm just doing nothing, they might ask me, do you have something to do? Do you want something to do? Or do you want to help us do this or help us do that? So people are noticing that I'm there. And I could add to that, they're noticing that this person is capable and competent and functional. They treat you with respect. They don't treat you like in a stigmatized way. When I first came in here, I was worried that I would be treated and talked down to like I was really slow. I went to the unit. In general, just the way the workers talk to you, like at first I couldn't tell who was a worker and who was a member because they just talked to other people like they were, not like they were bossing them around, but they were like they were working with them. Nobody likes being bossed around. People want to be able to work in environments in which they are valued and seen as capable. Just two more. Working 3 to 4 days a week really helped to get me back into society. It helped to make me realize, have a sense of self-worth, and also appreciate that there's a greater good to helping out. Even the little chores we do, like sweeping the floor, mopping, cleaning the bathrooms, these little things made me feel very important. And then my favorite one, those other ones came from enclave settings where people were gradually assisted and supported and learned how to do these things. This last one is from a young Swedish person who turned out to become Bowler of the Year for Sweden, Amateur Bowler of the Year for Sweden. Once he discovered his passion for bowling, he discovered bowling alleys. He started hanging out in them. He developed a real propensity for being a good bowler, so much so, as I said, he became Amateur Bowler of the Year. And as he explains, at the bowling alley, it doesn't matter if you're mentally ill, if you're a foreigner, an asthmatic, a dyslexic. Just as long as you bowl as many strikes as you can, you're just like everyone else. So when I'm playing a match, I'm worth just as much as anyone else, maybe even more, because he was so good. In a bowling match, everyone's a bowler. It's the number of strikes that counts, nothing else. And people want to be bowlers. They want to be neighbors. They want to be gardeners. They want to be skiers. They want to be all kinds of things. And their mental illness should not prevent them from pursuing those desires. But, you say, if those of you who work with people with prolonged disabilities, what if the person has no goals? It's a question we often get when we teach person-centered recovery planning. And it's very goal-focused. And the question is, well, what if people have no goals? First of all, most of us don't explicitly think of the things we want to do as goals. So you could say nobody has goals in their day-to-day lives. They just kind of muddle through as best they can, pursuing their passions and interests and trying to achieve things. But if you understand those things as goals, even though they're not called that, then it's hard to meet somebody who has no desires, no interests, no passions to pursue. If it seems like the person doesn't want to do anything or have any more of a life than being restricted to the mental health system, then these are reasonable questions to ask. Has the person become demoralized over time due to repetitive experiences of failures and losses that have been due to mental illness or discrimination or a combination of both? Has the person lost hope as a result? Remember, hope is one of the core community supports that people can be in need of and need to have modeled for them. Has the person become socialized into a mental health system that has not cared about his or her aspirations or interests in the past? Is what you are seeing the result of learned helplessness rather than a lack of goals? In other words, are people so used to not being asked what they want that they've decided that they don't want anything? Have they come to internalize or incorporate the perception of being a disabled mental patient or a person with a disability who can't do anything? Might the person be so impoverished that he or she does not have the means to pursue goals? Pursuing interests requires resources. If people have no income, if they're homeless, have no income, and have no family support, do they have any of the possibility of doing anything that would require resources? Do they first need to have access to resources before they can pursue interests? Has the person become afraid of taking risks, either because they might fail or be perceived as failing by others, or because either success or failure might precipitate a relapse or a setback? When we've asked clinicians in the past about referring people for supported employment who want to work, they worry that working will precipitate a relapse or a setback. Trying new things could destabilize someone who's finally gotten stable. So this can be a fear of taking risks, and it can be the person's fears as well. It's not necessarily a clinician's fears or a family's fears. It could also take the person's fears of taking risks. Taking risks can be scary. Could this person have a co-occurring depression? For many years in psychiatry, I'm still not sure why, but we thought that if someone had schizophrenia, they could not also be depressed. We now know that they co-occur quite often. So is the person depressed and not getting treatment for depression because they're getting treatment for something else? Have you made the effort to earn the person's trust so that he or she would feel comfortable enough to share such personal information with you? Trust, engaging people in trusting relationships is always the first step in any kind of rehabilitative practice. And if you don't have the person's trust, why should they tell you things that are important to them. And lastly, and I saved it for last on purpose, is the person experiencing signs or symptoms of a mental illness that might pose barriers to their participation in interesting or enjoyable activities. Someone loves music, but they also have auditory hallucinations. Do the hallucinations get in the way of their enjoying the music? I save it for last because it's often seen as the first reason, and in my experience, it has seldom been really the first reason that people are not participating in activities. It's usually much more areas in which we can make more progress more quickly than in the area of refractory symptoms. Why would people bother to have goals? So these are 10 top reasons to do something rather than nothing. These are reasons why people would want to do something. They want to become better at something or have a sense of accomplishment. They want to connect to other people, have a sense of affiliation. They have an interest in something, like Steve's interest in cars. He was just interested in cars ever since he was a kid with his Tonka trucks. He was interested in cars. In order to exercise their agency and or authority, to see themselves as capable. Experiencing pleasure or joy. Who doesn't want to experience pleasure or joy, but who might be afraid of stating that they want to experience pleasure or joy because of their disability or because of their history of stigma and internalizing stigma. For connecting to something larger than oneself, you call that a sense of spirituality or of faith. For reflection, quietude, or self-expression. For caring for and being good to oneself, or caring for others, as in the quotes I read to you earlier. And finally, for just prospering as a person, for thriving. These are all reasons that people have that would stimulate their interest in pursuing activities that they're not yet involved in. So that's the argument for community supports and community inclusion from the side of the practitioner and the person in recovery. And so a key question for the remainder of the time we have today is, can individuals become integrated in their communities only through individual means? So we have supported employment, we have supported education, we have supported socialization, we have supported parenting, we even have supported spirituality. These are all ways of helping an individual pursue an individual interest as an individual. And these are all very important tools in our toolbox. But the question I want to raise in the few minutes we have left is, does it perhaps also take social means to promote social inclusion? In other words, can we work on changing the community as well as the person, or supporting the person? Can we support the community to be more supportive of people with psychiatric disabilities, as well as support people in their individual efforts? Implications for mental health services and symptoms are that people with psychiatric disabilities need access to opportunities to contribute to their communities. We saw that time and time again about giving back or reciprocity or helping other people, along with community-based supports that may be needed for them to be successful. In addition to supported housing, employment, education, etc., this may mean volunteering. It may mean belonging to affinity groups like faith communities or interest groups or hiking groups or athletic activities, or it may be pet ownership, or it may be something as basic and simple and take it for granted by us as voting. When you vote, you're a voter, just like when you bowl, you're a bowler. Do people need access to opportunities to do things like vote or go on hiking trips or join a faith community? If we're going to promote access to those kinds of things, then we need to see beyond the array of individually oriented treatments and rehabilitation programs to fostering pathways for people to travel, to connect to their interests, aspirations, values, and peers. Some of the inspiration we derive for this comes from the Trieste model in Italy. It's a long story about Trieste being the hub for the work of Franco Basaglia, who was a revolutionary psychiatrist in the 60s and 70s. Italy remains the only country in the world that has outlawed mental hospitals, and it was in part based on the view that the disability was the hospital, not the person, or not the illness that the person had. But one of the mechanisms they developed in Trieste to close hospitals and to provide people with valued social roles were called social cooperatives, and they still have these in Trieste, and they have them throughout Europe, and they have them increasingly in Canada. We have not had much exposure to social cooperatives in the United States for reasons we won't get into today. But a social cooperative is a business or other program/agency organization that employs or involves persons with disabilities, but also involves persons without disabilities. So it may get tax breaks if it hires a certain amount of people with disabilities, but it's an integrated work setting or integrated activity setting where you would find people with and without disabilities together. If we're going to help people recover their citizenship, their community, if we're going to help people become included in their communities of choice and recover their citizenship, then we need to do more than what we've done in the past. Reduction of symptoms, signs, and impairments, while helpful, increasing and decreasing suffering, is not enough to ensure one's citizenship. Continuity of care, while important for the effectiveness, is not enough. Provider competencies, while key to obtaining outcomes, are not enough. And even instilling hope, treating people with dignity and respect, and caring genuinely, while necessary and humane, are not enough to help people regain their citizenship. And by citizenship, I obviously don't mean that in a legal nationality sense, but in the sense of being a valued member of one's community. To do that, the community itself can be the focus of an intervention. And these are the challenges and cautions of community-based interventions. Don't create artificial activities in segregated settings when they already exist in the community. Janis Condor, I mentioned before, who's a master at this kind of work, is fond of examples of when mental health centers first started to grapple with the fact that spirituality was important for people with serious mental illnesses, ended up enlisting clergy or having spirituality groups in the mental health center. And those are terrific as far as they go. But more often what people want is a connection to an existing faith community in the community. They want to belong to a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple. They want to be part of a faith community, not just exercising their faith in the mental health community. On the other hand, don't try to integrate someone into a community to which you do not belong, because you need to be an emissary for that person. And if you're not known and trusted by the community that you're trying to integrate someone into, why should they open their doors and be welcoming and supportive? Offer opportunities for people to develop valued social roles beyond their disabilities and illness-related identities, beyond anything related to mental health. So we have found in the work that we've done in Connecticut that helping people with disabilities join civic groups like Witnesses Against Hunger or housing advocacy groups or educational groups that offers them an identity beyond that of being a mental patient or a member of the mental health community, in which they mix and mingle with people of all types and all disability statuses and all races, ethnicity, cultures, etc. Build on strengths and cultivate an ambition for a meaningful life. Believe in people and believe in the fact that they have strengths and that they would flourish if they had more opportunities and supports to exercise those strengths. And make sure people feel welcomed in the broader community. Address stigma and discrimination in a proactive way and get role models out and about who can spread the message that recovery is real. I think I may have said this already in one of my earlier webinars, but for those of you who didn't participate in those webinars, I was very impressed. Recently I was in Manhattan and came out of the subway and saw a huge poster of Michael Phelps, the Olympian swimmer, who won an obscene number of gold medals in the last 3 or 4 Olympics for swimming. He's a national hero in the United States for his swimming prowess. And there was a huge poster of his face, but then it said, Psychotherapy saved my life. It can save yours. We need people like Michael Phelps and all the other celebrities who are out there in the open talking about how mental health is a human condition that all of us share, and that we should not be ashamed to ask for or receive help, and that we should remain valued members of our communities despite our mental health status. Is this cure? Is creating more welcoming communities in which people can pursue their interests a cure for mental illness? And the answer to that is no. This question was first raised explicitly to us when we published a paper in Psychiatric Services in 2006 about recovery. I don't remember which paper it was, but it was some paper about recovery. And Dickerson, who's a very well-known clinical leader in the country, responded by saying, mental illnesses are highly disabling, and as recent reviews have emphasized, our science has not come even close to being able to cure or prevent them. Learning to live better in the face of mental illness doesn't alter that reality. She was responding to a paper in which we talked about personal recovery, although we didn't call it that then. But the kind of recovery we now call personal recovery was learning to live better in the face of a mental illness. And her response was, well, that may be well and good, but it's not a cure. But I'm very proud of our response, so I'm going to quote it back. Because we said in response to her commentary, but from the perspective of the person with the disorder, she has it backwards. It is especially when the illness is most severe, and because we do not yet have a cure, that people who have these disabling disorders have no choice but to live in the face of them. This is the reality that takes priority in recovery-oriented care. And I will continue to fight for this position, that recovery-oriented care, first and foremost, helps people with disabling disorders live better lives in the face of their disabilities. And I think that's pretty important. I want to close with two more quotes. One from someone who has benefited from the kind of support we're talking about, who got a job and talked about how he saw the mental health system changing to enable him to do that. When I'm on the job, I do my job. I think everybody's capable of doing something. For many years, I did nothing. I was over-medicated and lay on the couch. We could say this is Steve 20 years later. That is the way I thought my life would always be. Now the whole thing of mental health is changing. It's really wonderful to see all these changes. Years ago, you didn't have much to look forward to. I thought I would spend the rest of my life in an institution. Now look at what's happened. I had a lot of people who pushed me along the way. I still have issues with self-esteem, but if you have people saying that you can try little things at a time. And the last quote I want to give you is, of all people, Eleanor Roosevelt, who gave a talk to the United Nations on the 10th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration. Because it's not just a matter of self-esteem and doing things that people say you can do. It's doing things that you have a right to do. People have the right to community inclusion. That's what the Americans with Disabilities Act stated very clearly in 1990. Just because you have a disability does not mean you have the right to be in the community and to take part in the community in the ways that you would like to do so. And she said it best, I think, when she framed it this way. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person. The neighborhood he lives in, the school or college she attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So I would beseech all of us who are mental health providers or advocates or family members or persons in recovery to view this issue of rights at that very basic and close to home level, and to help people to engage in the activities they aspire to pursue. And with that, I think I will stop. We have 5 minutes for comments or questions if you would like. Justin asked if I can provide the reference for the 68% number. The easiest place to find it is in a paper by Courtney Harding, John Strauss, and Joe Zubin, which was published in Psychiatric Services, I believe, in 1988, the title of which is Chronicity and Schizophrenia, Fact, Partial Fact, or Artifact. And Courtney is one of the leaders in synthesizing all the information on outcomes. Need for social justice and disability rights. Oh, a citation for the definition of clinical recovery and versatile recovery. Yes, it's actually on that slide. I cited Mike Slade's 2009 book called Personal Recovery. That's where that distinction came from, and it's taken off and is used now much more often than any other distinction that we've tried to distinguish between the two types of recovery. So it's on the slide. Bob says, I believe that recovery communities are the ultimate form of affinity groups. The shared lived experience, shared values, shared interests, and shared sense of marginalization, which creates a profound kinship of spirit, which is profoundly binding, inspirational, and normalizing. I certainly agree with Bob about the importance of recovery communities being affinity groups. I just also want to make sure that the door is open for people to feel like they can belong to any other groups that they are interested in as well. But oftentimes, belonging to the recovery community is the first step toward that kind of association with others. And hopefully it can be a stepping stone for other exploration of other community resources as well. It certainly has been for Bob, he says. Good for you. I can just remind you that all 4 of these webinars are cataloged on our website, the New England Mental Health Technology Transfer website. You can access any of these webinars. I hope you have found them useful, perhaps even inspiring in some ways. That was the intent. I wish you well with your work, and I hope you stay well over the next several weeks of this pandemic that we are experiencing. Stay well. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, for leading today's webinar, and thank you everyone who joined us today. Like mentioned before, an email with the evaluation will be going out, as well as when the screen closes, and more information about the CEUs will be going in a separate email as well. And again, we do want to thank you for your time participating on our webinar today.